I'm going to go ahead and mute you all, first of all, because sometimes we get background noise, and I will unmute you when it's time to, let's see, all of you will be muted. There we go. So when it's time to have conversation around other things, I'll unmute you so that we can respond to one another. But before we begin, I know some of you, you're all taking this for various reasons, and I know some of you need continuing education units for Yoga Alliance. So this entire course, the 5 hours of screen time and then the homework that you'll be doing, counts for 10 non-contact hours. And if you want me to do that for you, to count that for you, just shoot me an email. I've found the easiest way to certify people in that way and get the hours to count is for me to go in and manually enter your names rather than give some certificate or something. So if you'd like those CEUs for Yoga Alliance, please just shoot me an email. So I think like everyone else, when all of this began, which feels like months ago at this point, but really was only, maybe 3 weeks, I think, in our region, in our area right now, I sort of felt like the rug was pulled out from under me, and I felt really lost and confused and afraid, and felt like, everything I had worked for and was working towards was suddenly just thrown into disarray, and it felt very precarious. And I allowed myself to indulge in that for a good 24 hours. My poor sweet husband, I just cried and cried. And then something else emerged. And the only thing that I can say about that something else is that something else I know is born from the work that I do in my yoga practice, and the ability to be with the small challenges of daily life and the big challenges of daily life, and also to recognize that there is a much larger flow of consciousness that is sort of steering the ship here. And that fighting against that, even when it is excruciatingly painful, is useless. I've played that game enough in my life too. And so there has to be a willingness to sort of just get on board and see where all of this is taking us. And that doesn't mean that we don't allow ourselves to feel the waves and the fluctuations and the ups and downs that we experience in all of these moments. But when I then sort of pulled up the bootstraps and decided, okay, I'm going to build a platform, we're going to have an online studio presence, and we're going to just continue the work that we do in a very different way, and we'll adapt and we'll learn to do that. I sort of put in all the on-demand videos, and I scheduled all the live stream classes, and I thought, I feel like this is a moment that calls for something more. And I feel like while it's a beautiful opportunity for you to cultivate and nourish an at-home, on-the-mat practice, it's also a really potent opportunity for us all to dive into a practice of what it means to live our yoga every moment of every day. Not just to do yoga, not just to practice yoga, but to actually be living yoga. And it's living that yoga that is the most life-affirming, life-sustaining, the thing that's going to bring you the most equanimity. And fortunately, we have roadmaps to do just that. And the roadmaps go far beyond like do triangle pose or do down dog. That feels good in my body, and I need to work that energy through. And I recognize how vital and important that is as well. But at the same time, to be in the inquiry, I think, of these deeper practices and the deeper truths that are revealed to us through a lot of the ancient scriptures is much more useful in these kinds of moments. It's the moments of contemplation, of observation, and of integration that allow us to be really connected and present to what's going on without sort of the suffering that comes from trying to push it away or trying to make it something that it's not. We're all longing for this to be over. I get that. And we can hold that without that causing suffering. We can be present to this and be able to feel the fullness of it, the challenge of it, and still not necessarily have to suffer as a result of it. And that's where our yoga tools come in. So most of you, I know that we have these sort of moral and ethical guidelines built into the Yoga Sutras, and that the Yoga Sutras gives us a template for 8 limbs of yoga asana is one of 8, and the rest of the 8 limbs are much more far-reaching and broadly encompassing for the rest of your life. So the first of those limbs, the very first premise of living your yoga is the yamas. And the yamas, that word yama means restraint. Restraint's sort of an oversimplification of it. So restraint, so much of Sanskrit revolves around the ways and activities of ancient life at the time where that language was a spoken language. It's not really so much a spoken language now. It's written and it's used in yoga and in other traditions, but it's not, nobody's going to the store anywhere on earth and communicating in Sanskrit. But at one point that was common, and the word yama means restraint, but it also means sort of restraint with regards to the way one might restrain a horse, if you will. And that doesn't mean to hold back something that's rebelling against it, but this sort of unification and control of an animal, like an animal that might tend the fields or an animal that you might ride. And so I think that that is a little more revealing about what that word restraint really has to do with. When we talk about restraint in our English language, it can feel like restriction, or it can feel like very heavy-handed, rule-bearing, sort of like our Judeo-Christian tradition of commandments, the thou shalt nots. And I'm not here to disparage any of that. That's really powerful spiritual work as well. But this is about cultivating relationship and recognizing those aspects of you that might be drawn to the ego desires or the smaller self that tend to lead us awry, and harnessing those, cultivating those, integrating those so that you give primacy to your better nature and your higher instincts, ultimately unifying with something much greater, which is the infinite self, the self with a capital S, that isn't about the small way you're showing up in the world right now, but is about the infinite way that you're connecting to the world and consciousness itself and allowing that to stream through you. And it just makes sense. You know, we do a lot of talking in spiritual circles about transcendence and soul and self and spirit and source, and you can give that any name that you want, but all the movement on the mat that you do is not going to get you there. Like, it really is the work of daily life. And if you're not in right relationship to yourself, to your ego self and your highest self, and to the world around you, you really, we must start there. There's nothing to build upon. It's sort of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's the foundation. Be in right relationship, ethically, morally, to all aspects of yourself and to the world around you. And from there, we can do the spiritual work of growth and of transcendence and of transformation that we're called to through all practices of yoga. So as I said, the first of these limbs of yoga is the yamas. It means restraint, and there are 5 of those. And the first of those, and it's also, I think, important to recognize, everything in Sanskrit, as it's in written Sanskrit, is always ordered according to importance. So the word that comes first is given is the most important thing, or the sentence that comes first, or the phrase that comes first. So in this list of yamas and in this template for yoga, the very first thing, the very first principle or practice that we're given is the practice of ahimsa. And ahimsa means non-harming. So ahimsa, in regard to non-harming, that sort of negating can be confusing, I think, sometimes as well, non-harming. What does that mean? Does that mean non-violence? Does it mean always being at peace? Does it mean, what does that mean? And I'd like to kind of begin there. I'm gonna unmute you all, and I'd love to hear comments from you about, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to be living in a non-harmful way? Big or small things that come to mind when you imagine that?
I think vegetarianism is a big part of it.
Yeah, vegetarianism. I'm just going to let you popcorn out for now before we dig too deeply into it, but let's just sort of throw out concepts. So vegetarianism, yes. What else?
Sightseeing.
What's that?
recycling, not texting and driving.
Yeah, these little daily practices, sure. Anybody
I was
else?
gonna say self-care, like caring for ourselves so we can better, with respect to being able to care for others or the world around us. But we have to be able to embody that form of just self-love, self-care for ourselves before we can do anything else beyond ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Self-care is a huge part of this. And I think that one thing to remember always in any spiritual work is the work has to begin with you. We can go out. There's Liana. Hi, Liana. How are you, my dear friend? So we can go out and we can go into the world and we can do all kinds of good works and acts of kindness. But if we haven't done the inner work of purification, of introspection, of examining what's there that we need to tend to, then anything that we're doing outward is really going to fall short of what we really need for it to be. And so I think that any discussion of non-harming has to begin with what are the reasons that we cause harm in the first place? And I think if we go to that and we examine where those places are, then we can get into a space where it becomes more our second nature to avoid that. We have to see what's awry before we know what to fix. And I think for me, the three main areas that cause us to be in a harmful relationship to the world or to ourselves or to others or to the planet or to animals or to anything that you want to talk about. Number one, it's fear. You know, I think fear is one of the most toxic elements that we can experience. And I'll give you the tiniest little example of this. You know, in a world of non-harming, one of the things that gets tossed around in Buddhism takes this to huge extremes, by the way. And I'm not saying that that's the right way to be doing this or the wrong way to be doing this. But in Buddhism, the practice of ahimsa, if you were to go to a Buddhist temple, some Buddhist temples, you literally might see the monks in meditation, walking meditation, tiptoeing to avoid the bugs, the small ants that might be on the pavement in an honor of the life that is intrinsic to those teeny tiny little creatures of consciousness. And so that's massive, right? But I think we can look at that as a small example and say, you know, if we take this as sort of a metaphor for harmfulness in general, and we look at our willingness to do harm as emerging from a place of fear, you know, how many of us at one point in our life, and I know many of you have turned away from this at some point, but you know, that base fearful instinct to kill a spider, to kill a roach, to smash a bug, to do whatever, that is like this deep programming of I've learned to identify that as something to be afraid of. And my reaction, without even thinking about it, is to do that creature harm. And that, you know, we have grander things to address besides whether or not we're, you know, killing spiders and roaches. But at the same time, I think it illustrates a tendency to act out of fear without bringing consciousness to bear, without considering the result of that action for anyone other than protecting our own fear and our own selves. And so again, I'm going to unmute you all, and I'm curious to hear what you, like, where do you see that on a larger scale? We can talk about bugs all day long, but how do you see this manifest in the world where we may be causing harm out of fear?
I think keeping ourselves small, sometimes not sharing what we have out of fear can be sometimes, maybe, I don't know about harming, I guess, but just keeping yourself small.
Yeah, you know, that's so true, Dawn. And I think that, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Byron Katie, who's like a life coach, and she does this process called the work. And the work is always like, okay, what's underneath that thought? What's underneath that thought of, I'm afraid to share anything of myself, or I'm afraid to put myself out there. And what's underneath that is a deep script of, I'm not good enough. I don't know enough. I'm not worthy enough. You know, those are the things that make us hold ourselves back. And those thoughts are deeply toxic and deeply harmful. And there are fears sort of running the inner script that's sort of unraveling our inner world as well. Yeah. What else? Anybody else have an example?
I would say just lack of understanding, like that idea of I am separate from something else, and without leaning into being knowledgeable. I just think about just like other cultures and having, oh, well, that culture is, for example, and I'm not getting into politics, but the whole concept of the Mexicans crossing the borders, and they're all thieves, and they're all murderers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
No, it's not that. It's that concept of they're separate and we don't know who they are. And so we create these barriers without really just having a full understanding. And so it's just ignorance.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think you're hitting on something that's really deeply important, and that is this tendency. You could take out the word Mexican and put absolutely anything in its place in our current culture. It's anything from which we're separating ourselves, right? Anything at all. The philosophy of yoga says we are all consciousness manifest in different forms, and the form that take is neither inherently good or inherently bad. We are consciousness manifest in form. We are souls having a human experience, and it's our responsibility, particularly if we're going to practice this primary principle of ahimsa. It's our responsibility to see that in one another and to know that in each other. And when we do, the fear dissolves. And the consequence of dissolving the fear is that ahimsa is a natural byproduct. It's not so, and I say that to say, this isn't something we're trying to force or superimpose in our life, this idea of non-harming. And I think some of the ways that we try to practice non-harming sometimes can be superimposed or forceful, and that can be harmful. I work with a lot of people through yoga teacher training. Many of your faces are among them. And a lot of times in yoga teacher training, when we talk about ahimsa and we talk about why vegetarianism and yoga sometimes go hand in hand, and we talk about daily practices, and we talk about meditation, and there can be this sense of like, holy cow, I need to suddenly change everything about my life, right? And this forceful shifting of that and trying to manufacture change where we haven't done the inner work to understand even, the ideas and the concepts sound good. They align with a truth that we perhaps already know, but we haven't done the inner work to dissolve the fears and the places of unconsciousness and the deep stories that we're telling ourselves about inadequacy. We haven't taken the time to do that work. And so anything we're superimposing from the outside isn't stable and isn't balanced, and it's a struggle for us to keep that as a permanent change. How many of you have experienced that for yourself sometimes? You're like, yeah, this is the way, and I'm gonna do it right now. And then 2 weeks later, you're like, yeah, that was too hard, right? Well, because the work is deeper than that. It's like, what is underneath that? What is underneath that tendency to indulge in a steak and a glass of wine when you're feeling down and need comfort? What is underneath that tendency to swat at a spider that crawls across your desk when you're not thinking about it? What is underneath the fears that allow you to believe that whole nations of people are inherently evil? Like, that's where the work lies, in what's deep and underneath all of that. And that's inner work, and it's daily work. And I think that's what I like about this process of this course. That's the commitment that we're making here, is not necessarily to suddenly change these 27 habits that feel out of alignment with ahimsa, but to do the work of discovering what's inside that hasn't allowed me to be living in a way that is non-harmful in the first place. Does that make sense to everybody? And it's a different process. It's an inner to outer. And then what happens is that your outer actions inevitably come into alignment. When you see everyone around you as a soul, as a light, as consciousness, as as a manifestation of divinity, you're not going to do harm to people. It's just, it's out of alignment with a truth that you feel and deeply understand in yourself. And the same is true of animals, and the same is true of the planet. And so what we're working to do is to cultivate more of a, what I would call like a creeping consciousness, where we do the inner work and the outer work is an inevitable byproduct of that. And then we find ourselves living lives that are more harmonious with the deeper truths that we claim we believe in. You know, we're often keeping ourselves from those. So the first one, as I said, I think is fear. The second thing that I think keeps us out of alignment with a life of ahimsa is just lack of awareness, you know, lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. And I think, you know, this is, Patricia, you threw out vegetarianism, and I think it's an important conversation. It's a conversation that could take up all the bandwidth here, but it also tends to bring feelings of like shame and resentment to people. If you're not a vegetarian, it can bring feelings of separation when we have that conversation, because it is something you should come to on your own. And I think it's a very personal decision. There are people who have physical conditions where animal products are actually of benefit. Marnie up there is an Ayurvedic practitioner, and in Ayurveda, you know, animal products are part of it. And so I would encourage you to make an individual decision about that. But I think what's important, and this second thing that keeps us out of alignment with a life that is non-harmful, that is in alignment with ahimsa, is that every decision should be a conscious decision. And that requires that we begin to, I'm gonna mute you again. Somebody's got some racket in the background. But that decision, the decisions that we make need to be made consciously. They need to be things, you know, when you're putting something in the garbage, are you aware of the next implication of that? Do you recognize that if I put a plastic bottle in the garbage, it goes into a dump, it takes hundreds of years to eventually dissolve, that this is harmful to the planet? And we don't know until we know. So it's not about like beating yourself up for all of the places where you may have gone awry in the past, but it's about paying attention, about really harnessing and honing what in yoga and in many meditation practices we call a witness consciousness, so that I'm both participating in my actions and deeply aware of my actions and their first, second, third, fourth, fifth, infinite degree of implications. In yoga philosophy, the word for this is karma, like what is the effect of your action? And the idea is there's an effect on you personally, but there's also a ripple effect outwardly. And the more we're in tune to what those reactions and responses might be, the more careful we are with the choices that we make. So that what we're doing is responding to the world around us rather than reacting. Reaction is a fear response. Reaction is a lack of awareness response, where we're just sort of lashing out in the world and not doing it from a place of decision and integration and spiritual awareness in an effort to be in alignment. And this is like in every single moment of your day. Like, how highly tuned can you make that witness consciousness so that in every moment of your day you're aware? And that's a hard goal to hit. But that's what we're called to do, so that our actions are not just unconscious. We're gifted with this perception and awareness and this ability to differentiate, and with intuition that says, yeah, that's not quite right. That's not in tune with your highest self and what you could be and can be. And we need to learn to listen to that. And so how do we do that? Meditation, silence, journaling, self-observation. The more of that we can do, the more it becomes a habit built into our daily life and into every decision that we're making. So comments on that, anybody have thoughts about, or even stories about places where you, like, there was a sudden wake up, like, oh, I recognize now that I've been doing this thing that is out of alignment, because you just don't know until you know. And those can be big aha moments. Anybody ever have an experience like that? I see nods, but no stories. They're like, I don't want to talk about what I did wrong.
Mine was actually a killing of a spider. Like the first time that I had that whoa moment, like, no, don't do that. Like, oh my gosh, how many spiders have I killed in my life? And how many people have I felt like I rescued by helping them because they were afraid to kill the spider and I was fine to go kill the spider. Oh my gosh, how awful am I? They were the right ones. And yeah, that was for me that first instant of something's different here. Something's shifted in my train of action.
Yeah. I think, and I think in any discipline, we're talking about this in yoga, and yoga tends to really, yoga philosophy tends to deeply honor animals and the planet, very specifically. But even if we align this with the principles that so many of us have been raised with, if we go to just the commandment of thou shalt not kill, it doesn't say thou shalt not kill only humans who look like you and live like you and think like you and believe like you. It's like, thou shalt not kill anything. There's no parameters built into that. And that principle, it's said very firmly in the commandment, and it's a very broad, spacious statement in the Yoga Sutras. But that principle is not so much about what you shouldn't do as about how you should be in relation to the world. How you can begin to perceive the entire world as unified and connected in consciousness and spirit. All things, all animals, all beings, all of nature. And when you do that, those tendencies, we use the small example of a spider, but it's not a small example. It's a moment when you recognize that even this tiny creature is a creature, born of divinity into the world, and aligned somehow with who you are and participating in this great play of the universe and in nature itself, and has its role to play. And that's a huge recognition in maybe I shouldn't swat the spider. There's a lot that's built into that. And that doesn't come from somebody telling you don't do that. That comes from the inner work of cultivating your own awareness and your own unity with those deep principles. So
I wanted to bring up something that Marnie said at the beginning about not doing harm to yourself. And so at any rate, I was reading this book. It's called The Yamas and the Yamas. And so I decided I wanted to go to each one and find a nugget in what she had to say about each one that I wanted to carry with me. And on Ahimsa, she said about non-harming of self, set an agenda where you can express your true self. And I found that really powerful because, when you talk about not doing harm to yourself, you kind of have to back up, because so often we set ourselves up where we're in such a place that it's impossible, or it feels impossible to be good to ourselves, or to express ourselves, or to feel good about ourselves and about life. And so I thought later on, when I was looking at it, I thought, well, what does that have to do with non-harming? And I had to kind of work it out in my head and go back through like what Marnie said about non-harming yourself and being able to do what's good for you by expressing your true self.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree. That's so important. And some of that, again, comes with the deeper work of unraveling the stories we've told ourselves, or that we've inherited from others who've told them to us. Many of us are running on a deep underlying script of a story of how we've identified, little things like maybe you grew up with a sibling and one of you was the smart one and one of you was the troublemaker. Maybe you didn't follow a path that somebody else set out for you. Maybe you are carrying a burden of shame from choices that you've made in your life, and you're allowing those to be your story. Maybe you are carrying a story of victimhood or of suffering that you're unable to let go of. And I think the first principle of non-harming is to recognize those stories, honor, of course, our experiences, but to recognize that you are still very much whole and infinite and divine, no matter what your story is, and to begin again to cultivate that witness consciousness. And so we can talk about self-care all we want, and I think in our Western world, self-care often translates into indulgence. Like, I need a manicure, or I need a bubble bath, or I need a massage, or I need a nice dinner, or a quiet nap, and we can often begin to associate that with self-care. And I'm not saying any of those things are bad or wrong, but self-care, what if we thought about self-care as self-care with a capital S, you know, like the highest self-care. And then self-care translates to prayer, meditation, contemplation, time in silence, connecting with nature. And those things are actually more affirming, more, and will bring you into alignment with something that's much more whole. It doesn't mean don't pamper yourself sometimes. I love a good massage too. But it means that deep self-care is about something more than the egoic self that has a limited desire and a limited understanding of what feels good, not what is good for my spirit, my soul, and for everything around me. And that, I think, is what we're called to do with Ahimsa is, yes, self-care, but self-care at the highest of all levels. And that means tuning ourselves. You know, if you've taken teacher training with me, you know I love this image of the Aeolian lyre. The Aeolian lyre is a harp with very, very fine strings, and no one plays the harp. The work every day of the harpist is to tune the strings so precisely that when set in the wind, what blows through the harp is beautiful and perfect. And I think that's our work on ourselves, is to not play a harp or an instrument or make anything happen, but to tune the strings so finely and so precisely that we're used well by spirit and source and truth, and that what comes through us is non-harmful for ourselves and for others. And that's a kind of purification more than it is a layering on of any particular practice or habit or methodology. It's cleansing and purifying so that the truth of our nature can flow through with more grace. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, and I think that, I know I've heard you tell that story before, Sheila, but I think this is the first time, like, I actually really, like, I have some tears in my eyes right now, because it's just such a beautiful way of looking at things. So thank you.
Yeah, good. I'm glad. Yeah, that's why I say it again and again. Sometimes it has to land just right. So the invitation through this process, and I know this is a really short meetup. I would love so much more time with every single one of you, your sweet faces. But the invitation in this process is that each week we embark on a journey of discovery with each one of these principles. And so each one of you, now that you're enrolled in the class, you should have access to the homework sheet. Did anybody download that today, the PDF? Okay.
Yes,
I also
did.
just, you can go back in. So go back into the Yamas and Niyamas product in NamaStream. And there's a homework sheet there, which are some suggested inquiries and activities. There's some journaling in there. There's an opportunity to set intention. There's a little snippet of a poem and some suggested ideas about how to be in relationship to these principles. And we'll have one of those each week. I've also, just this afternoon, if you haven't revisited this today, I've loaded in both Sonia's recorded loving kindness meditation and a script of a loving kindness meditation from Jack Kornfield, who's a very well-known Buddhist meditator. And Patricia, you mentioned the book that I recommend for our sessions, which is that Deborah Adele, The Yamas and Niyamas. It's excellent, and it's very well grounded in daily life, and in it's very clear-eyed in how we can perceive and understand these things. One of the things that I love that Deborah Adele talks about with Ahimsa is she uses the story. So Ariel, you might be a little young for this, but most of the rest of us, I think, have seen The Karate Kid, the movie The Karate Kid. And I loved that movie when I was young. But in The Karate Kid, you know, Daniel discovers Mr. Miyagi, and he's just pruning his bonsai tree, and he's living this very quiet, very secluded sort of life. And Daniel thinks it's a little bit strange and doesn't really understand it until things get really difficult. And then Mr. Myogi demonstrates this incredible power and skill in his karate and is able to protect him. And then when Daniel wants to learn to do the same thing, he's frustrated because he's taught paint the house, like, remember, wash the car, paint the house. I love this movie. And what that's about is presence. It's about like living a life of ahimsa and non-harm, and participating in the world in this way is about being deeply present. And when you're deeply present, you won't necessarily have to do harm, because you'll have all the defense you could ever need. You will know, and it will be built into your being to be absolutely tuned into what you need to be in that moment for your own protection and survival, and you needn't fear anything. And I think that's a really powerful and potent message about ahimsa. It's not that we have to learn to battle or to fight or to superimpose anything that it feels unfamiliar or feels forced. It's that we have to learn to be deeply present and engaged with our daily lives in a way that is peaceful and is harmonious. And that begins the moment we wake up in the morning until the moment we go to bed at night, and maybe even in dream time if you're a lucid dreamer. But it's an everyday process of engaging. And like anything else, we have to train ourselves to do this. You know, we have to commit. We'll get to this in the second part. We deal with the niyamas, and one of the niyamas is tapas. It's the daily discipline of awakening to yourself, the daily discipline of practicing presence, the daily discipline of living your yoga, not just doing shapes on a mat, but living in alignment with source and with consciousness and with divinity. And we have to make a commitment to that. And so the homework sheet hopefully will allow you to do that and give you some tools to start to build that into your daily life. And you don't have to live a monastic life to do this. You don't have to go hunker down into a cave, but we are gifted in this moment. There is fear, there is struggle, there is suffering, but in this moment, there is also stillness and quiet and a lack of a lot of the activities that are distractions from this work. And so we have an opportunity built into what's happening right now to really prepare ourselves for what's to come, whatever that might be, so that we meet it in a way that feels more peaceful and more integrated. So we've got about 5-ish, 6-ish, 7-ish minutes left before we end. And I want to open it up to questions and comments and any conversation you have around this. And like, are there any moments in this discussion where you're like, oh yeah, this is the thing that I know I need to do to be more deeply in alignment with these principles, or this is the thing I know will be a struggle around that. And part of having community is that we get to hold each other in that space as well. So, anybody?
It just resonated a lot with me, how you put that, Sheila, about being deeply present. And so there's really no need to do harm and no need to react out of fear. And that's just applicable across the board to so many things throughout every day. That resonated with me huge today. Thank you.
Yeah, good, awesome.
I just have a question, and I don't know if I missed it or what, but my notes. But there was like three things that keep us out of alignment, and I had the one that was fear. The other one was like the lack of knowledge.
What is the third?
Yeah, what was the third one?
The third one, we sort of tiptoed around the third one when we talked about fear. The third one, I think, is anger. You know, I think that so often we don't have control of our own anger response. Anger is a normal human emotion, by the way, and I'm not suggesting at all that you not feel anger. In fact, there's a place in every spiritual discipline where the luminary has a moment of outrage, of sort of righteous indignation. And so it's not necessarily that it's bad or wrong for us to have the feeling of anger, but when we allow anger to run the show and run the script, then we really risk doing harm. And the harm is more to ourselves than anybody else. Like, how many of you, and I'll be shocked if you don't all raise your hands, but how many of you have ever lashed out of anger and said things or done things that you deeply regretted afterwards? And then the burden becomes that you're carrying shame around that. You're carrying shame around how you've reacted rather than responded, and how you've treated or perhaps harmed someone that you never meant to do that. And so learning to manage our own anger, not so that we suppress it or negate it or pretend that it's not important information, but like every emotion, you know, the principles and practices of yoga and meditation encourage us to see emotions as teachers, as sort of teachable moments. So if my heart is swelling and open with love, I'm learning something there about community, connection, about my own likes and dislikes, about where I feel comfortable. If I am recoiling in anger or feeling heated or stifled, I'm also drawn, I need to learn something about that. What is it? What is the thing in me that is resisting whatever the moment is and unable to be present for myself and another person or a situation in a way that could diffuse that and find a place of connection and find a place where I can still, even when I'm angry with somebody, see their light, see their divinity, see their truth, see their soul. Are we always going to be successful at this? Of course not. Of course not. But if we tune into it, we can more frequently be successful at it. And the anger, you know, the fear, like they're so often hand in hand. The anger, the unconsciousness, and in so many ways, anger is a product of these things where we're out of alignment and we're reactive and combustible. And it can be too, you know, in Buddhism, one of the causes of suffering is like lack of regulation. So that this is where self-care comes in. You know, if I'm not sleeping, if I'm not eating well, if I'm not spending time in nature, if I'm not doing higher self-care, then I'm more likely to be a victim of and victimizing others with my own emotional responses. So we sort of shut down the witness consciousness when we're not taking care of ourselves and nourishing ourselves in the way that we need to. Any other comments, thoughts?
I think all those, the fear, the lack of knowledge, and anger are exactly where we are right now, you know, with this, our situation. So anything that helps us sort of manage.
Yeah, I think absolutely right, Leanna. Like that is like the palpable energy of our universe right now. Everyone is living with at least a little bit of fear. Everyone is living with sort of a deep sense of lack of knowledge or understanding of what in the world is going on. And everyone is living, I think, with some degree of outrage at how it's being handled or not handled, or how we're caring for each other or not caring for each other, or who is receiving care or who's not receiving care. So I think, yeah, we're all in that. We're all in that deeply human, deeply vulnerable experience. And that is why this is like the best time of all to be committing to this practice, because we can watch the alchemy of that. And I see that in myself. You know, I have these waves of like, you know, freak out moments, really. And then I meditate, or I go for a walk, or I journal. And there's a remembering. When we do the practices that we know nourish us, there's a remembering of your own wholeness, of your own connection, of your own truth. And that sort of like, it boosts your spiritual immunity. It elevates those places in you that are able to withstand anything that might happen in your life. And again, I'll bring you back to like the people we elevate as spiritual luminaries did not live comfortable lives. They lived lives of deep suffering, most of them. Think Mother Teresa, think Gandhi, think Jesus. Like these were lives of tremendous suffering and struggle. And yet they taught us something about how we can be there with equanimity and still be practicing ahimsa as sort of the deep programming of our nature, because that's our truth. And whatever happens, if you can stay in alignment with that, you'll have a sense of peace no matter what happens outside of you. So I'm gonna finish up, and I want to thank every one of you. I love being in this conversation. I always joke when I'm in teacher training that like my dream life is to sit on the floor and talk about consciousness all day long. So thank you for playing my game. It's a deep, deep honor to be here with all of you. I would love to stay, but we do need to wrap up because Sonia's broadcasting at 6, and so she's going to need the system. But I really want to be in this conversation with you. So please feel free to reach out as you dive into the homework and into these practices. I would encourage you to make the meditation either with the script or the one that Sonia did, or some version of your own loving kindness meditation, your practice for the week, and just see how that begins to transform things. Even if you have another way that you like to meditate, just see if this one might bring some new awareness in this week as we're in this particular contemplation. But thank you all so much for being here. It is a true delight, and there is magic in this strange new world that we can connect in this way. So I'll use the word namaste, which really means the light in me sees, honors, and knows the light in you. So thank you all so much for being here, and namaste. Reach out with questions or to share aha moments on your journey. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sheila.
Bye.
Sheila. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.